Good morning. Are y'all awake? Good morning. There we go. That's a bit better. That might be the most thorough introduction I have ever received, ever. And now my talk has to be real good. Thank you all so much for having me. It's such an honor to be back here because, as you just heard, I was here 9 years ago when I was somewhat at the beginning of my food systems journey. And so to return here where I am now, a mother, a wife, so much life has happened between now and then. So thank you. Thank you for receiving me along the course of my arc. And what you also heard in that introduction was some of my climate change work, and just a brief note about that because it's something that's bringing me joy and inspiring me right now. Van Jones took a chance on me, and that was the reason I moved up to Oakland in the first place, was to be his executive aide when he was building Green for All. And last week just announced that he's the new CEO of a institution called Reform, which is Jay-Z, Meek Mill, and a few billionaires putting $50 million together to do prison reform in the country after a historic prison reform bill was passed by Dream Corps, Van Jones's team. So just watching his arc from a black lawyer, watching young black men getting put into prison in his mid-20s, to decades later, harnessing that amount of public and private capital to actually make it happen, it's possible. Dedicating your life to work, you can see change in your lifetime on that level. So I'm really proud of him, and I just wanted to share. Yeah. So what are we here to talk about today? What's the problem? The problem is that you are farmers who are seeing the destruction of the natural environment happen at a pace that is astonishing right now. And I say you're farmers, you're ranchers, you're practitioners, you're all over the place. But even regular people like me, watching my baby cough during that campfire was devastating for me. Also, part of the problem is the risks of working the land right now. We're heading toward another economic recession, from what I hear, and that's terrifying for a lot of people, but it can be particularly terrifying for those who make their livelihoods working the earth. And finally, the problem is our volatility as a society right now, as a country. The feeling of division, the conversations about identity, especially when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. It can feel like those conversations are too scary for some, and then not scary enough for others. And you're either in one camp or you're in the other, and never the twain shall meet. Because just being okay almost feels like an affront when things feel so bad sometimes, right? So those are just a few of the problems. There are many. But the level of instability can feel like the biggest problem of all. The consequences of those problems, those are big and those are out there, but how do we experience them? It can feel like we've lost our middle ground to connect with other people. And without middle ground, you can't connect. And then when you can't connect, that feeling of isolation and being alone, just alone, can take over. How many people have felt like isolation, and just your feelings of that have increased over the last few years? I just want to get a sense. Oh, okay, all right. Yeah, so quite a few of you. And that feeling of isolation, the particular thing of it that seems like it's increased over the last few years is that you don't want to only spend time around people that agree with you. All of us know from kindergarten that being around different types of people is important. But then you get around different types of people, especially these last 2-3 years, and those differences can just be like, what'd you just say? You supported who? Did you even vote? And it's just like, things that used to be casual conversation are now like, I'm unfriending you from Facebook. You can no longer spend time around my children. Like, it's gotten pretty urgent, right? And that's no way to get to middle ground. Burnout and general mental health issues are also another thing that seems to be taking over these last few years. That's a consequence of those big picture problems. And you can't burn out. If the people who work our land burn out, what are the rest of us gonna do? And especially you. You aren't just the people that work the land. You're the people who actually care about the land while you're working it, which is not everyone who works the land. You care, period. This group of people, there's not that many of y'all. So you can't burn out. So that consequence is actually pretty important to me. And then finally, the loss of hope. If it's this bad, why try? Why? All that wonderful stuff I said about Van Jones in the beginning, and it's possible in your lifetime. I know probably 2 years ago, my legit thought when I heard something like that would have been, yeah, but that's Van Jones. He's like God, so you're saying I have to be that in order to create change in my lifetime? Well, shit. I guess we're all gonna die. So it's that loss of hope that also seems to be infiltrating. I myself have been a victim. Now, this was just the context, y'all. The talk will get better. This is the last time we're gonna talk about all the hopelessness, okay? So my personal story of all of these things that I was just sharing, I wanna start with a different kind of foundation. Normally, this is the first talk where I feel like I've shifted my perspective a bit, and a lot of that has to do with my son. I've been looking at the longer arc of what's the soil that I come from, and where were the beneficial microbes in the soil that I came from. And that was artistry in my family. And it was activists and folks who wanted to fight for the health of their communities. One of my favorite stories to tell about my family is that my grandfather was in the Delta Rhythm Boys, which was a blues quartet that was pretty famous in the 1940s-ish. And my grandfather worked on a lot of soundtracks, movie soundtracks in Hollywood. And so he and his best friend worked on Gone with the Wind. And so they were wandering around the set of Gone with the Wind, and it was the first Hollywood production where there were that many extras. So there was a lot of infrastructure that we know now as Hollywood and just regular Hollywood that Gone with the Wind piloted. And porta potties was one of them, because there were that many extras. And on the set, my grandfather and his friend were wandering around, and there were the colored porta potties, and there were the white-only porta potties. And my grandfather, being who he was, found Clark Gable's trailer, knocked on the door, and said, hey, can we have a conversation about race in America? And they got Clark Gable so riled up about this that he walked to the director and said, I am walking off the set of this movie if you do not desegregate the porta potties. And yes, claps for my grandfather. That is how my grandfather got the set of Gone with the Wind a little more integrated. And that was how he did his activism. He could sing in 9 different languages. He sang in Japan, he sang in Sweden. He exposed the world to African American culture in a way that only you could do if you were an artist back then. And that's so much of my family. Even if they weren't overt activists, they were weaving stories of something that was possible beyond what was here right now. And I believe that coming from a people, and all of us have those people in our families, those who believed in something better. And I wanted to start my story with that seed within me and to encourage you to find that seed in your history as well, because it's something to really lean on when times get hard. Part of the problem and consequence in my life is that all those problems that I just identified, I was also speaking of myself. I went through the climate change, the food systems stuff. I got to the peak of my career when I was on television and I was, getting on a plane, taking a red eye to New York, showing up on national television that morning, heading to a TEDx talk, and then ending the afternoon with asking for $500,000. Like, that was my life at some point. It was really hard. I felt like I was doing the good work, but it was really hard. And then ending those evenings, talking to climate scientists in bars in DC, and drunk climate scientists are not people you want to spend time around. Because they will just basically be like, you want to know what's really going on? We just wrote this report of the White House, and we're all gonna die. I know I said only 2 degrees. We're already past that, and it's just, I'm moving my family to Madagascar. And I'd be sitting there listening to them like, are you for real right now? But then it would really sink in, right? Like the people who had the most information were basically drinking themselves to death because they were so scared. And I just couldn't hold that. So in 2014, I had a pretty severe breakdown. I left my job, I lost a lot of friends, and I ended up in a puddle on the ground, wondering what I was gonna do and where there was hope. So then I got invited to a workshop on soil carbon sequestration, which I had never heard of, a lot of big words. And I ended up listening to a TED Talk by Alan Savory about desertification. And I was like, for real? This was here the whole time? I was doing this at People's Grocery? Why didn't anybody tell that climate scientist? And that became my question. In a lot of ways, soil saved my sanity. The hope and the promise of carbon sequestration first, then really the understanding that building soil fertility is a physical, concrete, somewhat linear act that you can see and touch and taste and feel in the soil, but it provides deeper truths. The idea of what it takes to build fertility is a worldview. It's one of the main things that separates indigenous culture from Western culture, is the idea that fertility is a lifestyle that is so far beyond physical land. It's inside you. It's the way that you speak to people. It's the way that you raise your children. It's the way that you run your businesses. That's really what we're talking about today. Fertility is the framework. So what do we do? What do we do with that framework? What do I do? I used to work on issues. I used to be focused on trying to solve climate change, on trying to build healthy food systems. And at some point, I recognized that so much of my nonprofit work, and even some of my for-profit work in the beginning of my for-profit days, was trying to inject fertilizer in very specific ways, trying to grow very specific things, and I was missing the soil underneath. Now I work on the soil. I work with leaders and I work with organizations who are the soil of the movement. Why? One of the things that I heard at the Women in Regenerative Agriculture talk on Tuesday is that we're losing 2 billion tons of topsoil a year. Thanks, Dr. Chris Nichols. Jesus. But what that made me think of is if fertility is a worldview, and if we are reflections of what's happening in our soil, what are we losing per year? What of our health is eroding? Our mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual health. We must care for ourselves as much as we're caring for the earth, and vice versa. So what we learn from soil, and having soil as a mentor, is learning how to turn the pieces of our lives, and all of the pieces, the joy, the pain, the pleasure, the grief, into building blocks of fertility, and thus power. Thank you. Power! So then some specific examples of this. Soil as mentor. Now I just want to note, before I go into this, I ain't got a degree in biology, okay? I got 6 years of African American studies under my belt. I could not describe how carbon gets sequestered if I tried. And I've listened to all the books, y'all. I've watched all the YouTube videos. Me and David, I have the biggest intellectual crush on David Montgomery. Like, if I ever meet him in person, I'm just gonna be like, oh my God, she wrote the book about microbes, and it was so cool. That's me. But I am not a biologist. So think of this as inquiry and inspiration and curiosity. And if you want to come up to me afterward and be like, so that thing you had said about soil doing this, it doesn't actually do that. It does this. Feel free. I will take it all in. I just may not retain it. So I just want you to witness this as inquiry and curiosity, okay? Pruning disease. One way that this shows up, oh no, back. It's a radio, I heard, and you don't have to point it anywhere. Let's see if that works. Hey! Okay, now if it stays there, boom, I did it. So one of the things Soil and Shadow does is we work with institutions and leaders to develop projects that engage their communities in interesting ways. One of my favorite projects over the last couple of years was a theater professor who heard me on a podcast talking about soil as a metaphor, who said, hey, I am doing a project on my campus where we have a building that was named after one of the architects of white supremacy, who also happened to be a governor in the state of North Carolina, and the building is being renamed the Women's Building, which is wonderful. And I would like a bit more discussion about how we get from point A to point B. I was thinking of doing like a performance art piece in front of the building during the grand opening, and after listening to your podcast, I was wondering if it could be a tree pruning workshop that's using tree pruning as a metaphor for how to get disease out of a system when thinking about race. Is that something you could write? Is that what you do? I'm like, yes, sir. It's what I do. And thank God I could call Kelly Mulville at Piscinus Ranch and be like, so Kelly, tree pruning? Just talk me through that. So in collaboration, I had the race part, he had the tree pruning part, and together we wrote a metaphorical journey on race and ecology masquerading as a horticulture workshop on tree pruning. Yes. It was beautiful, and it was performed on campus in front of the building. And no one knew what was going on. They just thought it was a random tree pruning workshop happening during this building opening. And then afterward, they got the script with some provoking questions that I want to talk about. One of the things we went over in that play is that if you're going to shift the directive energy of a tree, you must respect the tree's existing flow first, or you run the risk of damaging the tree. Kelly talked about that a lot. Trees grow in a particular way. And when pruning, witness the growth first so that you can make alterations that are in flow and you're not just chopping willy-nilly. What do we damage ourselves by our lack of patience and attunement in our actions within ourselves and with our communities? That was one of the inquiries. In this example, architects of white supremacy were people. They were flawed. They made terrible decisions and did actions that were even worse, but they also loved their families. They also loved their people. How do we shape our futures around complex histories like this? How do we prune disease, flawed actions, flawed worldviews without damaging ourselves in the process? And then how do we take decay and rot and things that need to die and ensure that instead of casting whole people away, we build something new? We compost them into something that can be the building blocks of something else. Those were the inquiries in this piece. We really need to figure this out. This piece feels even more relevant this year because so much, I mean, basically our last few years has been Oh, look, diseased limb. Oh, look, diseased limb. Oh, look, diseased limb. Whereas before, one of the ways I like to talk about the difference in the last couple of presidents is, I don't know if you've seen The Never-Ending Story, but when 44 was in office, we were all on Valcor, riding high above Fantasia, like, yay, everything's great, woo! When in fact, the nothing was present. We were just soaring above it, smiling. And then 45 came in, and he was like, hey, yo, there's this wolf called the Gamuk, and we about to destroy everything. But that means our imaginations have to be bigger. That means we have to see that all of that was always there. We just actually need to integrate it now. We need it to rot, and we need to turn that shit under the soil. Okay? And if that's true, you are the ones in regenerative agriculture who can take this metaphor way the hell farther than I can, because you actually know how to do that. So you need to teach me, and you need to teach all of us. That is my call out to you. Another example of how this shows up: organizational and business culture. One of my favorite things about soil is how giving it what it needs will allow it to do its job much better than we could. Another of my favorite things that Dr. Chris Nichols talked about in her talk on Tuesday is how she went into graduate school and they said something like, we know 10% of the organisms that are in the soil, and then she left graduate school and they were like, we know like 0.1 of the organisms that are in soil. And that's life. We come in, we're in our teens and 20s, and we're like, I got this figured out. If those old people would just X, Y, Z. Then you get to 30, 40, 50, and you're like, oh shit. I don't know nothing. It's a beautiful process of learning and unlearning. And focusing on fertility the whole time can be a way to just let the wisdom and calculus level things in life take place. Communities are the same. Businesses are the same. Teams are the same. I get a whole bunch of inquiries from leaders and institutions and businesses. Our teams need to be high performing, and they're not. Come help us. And building organizational culture is something that we do. So when it comes to lessons from the soil and those universal truths, what are your goals? Something that also came up on Tuesday is, why are you building the land? Do you just want to beat it to death so that it can serve you and make you money for your family because it is there to serve you? Or do you actually care about the land because the land has inherent value, and so do all of the beings that live in it? And let me tell you, your staff can tell the difference. And so can your communities. If you care about them because they have inherent value, wonderful. Your goals can match their goals, and you can move forward and thrive. If you care about them because you want them to make you money, that ain't gonna fly. And if you care about them because you're concerned about the things that you cannot change, so you working for your community makes you feel better, but doesn't actually help the community, that's also you acting and exerting your will onto a community without consent. So, check your goals. Discover alignment. Don't force alignment. Discover alignment. And that's how to create high-performing everything. Another thing that needs to be said here is that when you allow a community to be a community and you align your goals, mistakes will happen. Very high-performing teams. Pixar, Creativity Inc., wonderful book. They talk about the brain trust process in the Pixar office and how they will let directors make mistakes with their teams because they know that the best way to find the right story that needs to be told is to tell a bunch of the wrong ones in a petri dish and make sure that that process is very well held. Can you handle that with people, and can you handle that with your teams, and can you handle that with your land, knowing that it builds resiliency, the ability to allow for mistakes? Diversity. Investing in the diversity of land, insects, animals, microbes, all the things, creates a petri dish that allows for the good things to outcompete the things that are killing the system. It's the same with people. Increased diversity encourages cycles of learning. That means that trust, connection, relationship outcompete mistrust and greed. An example, we worked with a foundation to coach 9 of their staff members, 3 different program teams that together controlled between 15 and 20 million in the regenerative agriculture and climate space. And it was through 2 years of individually coaching these people that we were able to see them engaging their coalitions differently, working through conflicts with grantees without withdrawing their funding, and them not burning out, which was super key. Because in so many ways, and you know this, foundations hold a lot of institutional memory as organizations build and bust, right? So it's also important that program officers don't burn out. And we were able to see that with this team. Finally, investing in the mycorrhizal network. Creating regular spaces of real talk so that relationships can take care of their own issues instead of always coming to you to solve their problems. I'm sure no one has experienced that before. Getting teams together and then having to mediate everything. This also leads to many mistakes. And the example that I wanted to lift up is not one that Soil and Shadow worked on directly, but is my husband, because I have seen him do something remarkable. He runs a community center in Oakland, and it's the arc of 20 years worth of work in Oakland. First working at a homeless shelter, then doing a record company within the homeless shelter to give those young people an outlet other than destruction in the streets, to an entire community media center built on arts and cultural healing as the foundation that also does social entrepreneurship with the youth. He's playing the long game, and building the mycorrhizal network in this way can feel like playing the long game. You are not putting direct inputs to get direct crops that are going to make X amount of money next year. You're doing things like what Kristen Leach talked about on Tuesday, where she let one of her crops fail almost in its entirety, just to save the seeds from the few plants that survived, so that within a few years, she had the baddest crop anyone had ever seen. Galen is doing the same thing at his community center. He's allowing for conflict. He's allowing for a healthy amount of stress. The issue, of course, being that when it comes to people of color, any amount of stress for us can feel unhealthy because our context a lot of times can feel like stress. It takes a remarkable amount of courage to say, stress is the only way to build resiliency, and you have to start somewhere. Will you come with me on this? He can feel like he's sacrificing. He talks about this a lot. How carrying that healthy amount of stress and trying to build resiliency against what feels like impossible odds just feels like it can suck his soul sometimes. The amount of grief he carries is tremendous. But what is he building? He has literally saved lives by running his business this way. And it ain't just all the touchy-feely stuff, which I try to remind him. I'm like, bruh, you got $1 million in the bank and you running a 7-figure business that's negotiating a $15 million commercial real estate deal right now. For all intents and purposes, you a successful businessman, bruh. You working 30 hours a week, raising your first child. You took a 3-month paternity leave with no paternity policy. So this isn't just a bunch of touchy-feely stuff. This is how to build true resiliency, which is not just internal, soft, woo. It is also financial. It's also security. That's important. And fertility is the way to get there. That's what's possible. Finally, coaching is your personal cover crop. Cover crop is about protecting the soil so that the intensity of inputs that it's getting from the sun, from the rain, give it just the right amount of nutrients while protecting it from an onslaught of input. For yourself, how much of you is exposed in a way that's encouraging brittleness? There are parts of you, there are parts of me, there are parts of all of us that are exposed soil that's baking in the sun. And in our case, the sun is the news. It's babies dying at the border. It's all of the things we're taking in about what it is to be human and American right now. The impact is that you can be hardening without even knowing it, and sapping your energy and your resources as a result, so that you get less productive, less hopeful, and you eventually burn out. So the question is, how do you protect yourself while still absorbing nourishment and care? You sometimes then, and by you I mean me, we sometimes careen to the other extreme. Okay, I was hard and brittle. Now I am concrete. I let nothing in. I use my defense mechanisms that build a wall, terrible, so thick that nothing happens then. Nothing grows within me. No nourishment get in. All of my beneficial bacteria, also known as generative thought, imagination, die. So yeah, I'm alive, but I'm just dirt. I ain't soil. I'm not fertile. I'm not creating anything. The way to go is protection strategies that are generating so much life and so much goodness for us that they outcompete the bad stuff. It outcompetes destructive self-destructive thoughts, inner resistance, and unwillingness to change. It's possible to have that much joy and that much peace within you, that it outcompetes all the other things. And that's also part of what we do in our coaching work. We create a combo of Gestalt and yoga and shadow integration that give people the tools to cover crop themselves in ways that provide a solid foundation to then plant business ideas, a beautiful family life, and anything else that they want to grow. These tools exist. The ability to create that perfect balance of just enough protection that lets in just enough sunlight and water, personally, these are things humans have been experimenting with for thousands of years. The tools exist. It's just translating them into our lives in particular and having guides that can hold our hands and show us the way. And functionally, that's what I was just talking about when it came to organizational culture and when it came to those special random art projects that come up too in terms of supporting leaders, businesses, and organizations in the movement. It's all about that perfect amount of protection that is not protection from connection, just protection from the things that sap life. A couple of examples, before some examples. The hard part of that, the work takes time. You ready? Yes. You ready? Yes. That's great news, because the bad news is society won't be. Okay? It takes courage to do that. Society moves at the pace of high velocity, get things done now, productivity, productivity, productivity. Oh, you're sacrificing yourself for all that productivity? Wonderful, let me give you a raise. That's how mainstream society works. So you doing this work means that you step into a form of leadership that can feel a little lonely, but is actually what's going to save humanity. You end up pulling your resourcing from a different place. Now for some examples. One of the women we worked with was an executive, a New York executive at a big makeup company, who wanted to improve her leadership, her personal cover crop, so that her team could be more high-performing and efficient. After a little bit of our work together, she said, my team is just starting to do the stuff that I said I wanted them to do in the beginning. And I'm like, how about that? They're witnessing you be a badass, and they're like, yo, we can be badasses too. That's one of the impacts of the work. Another one, a Midwestern communications specialist we worked with, ended up losing 25 pounds. And I was like, that is not one of the things we try to go for. But that cultivation of the internal joy and pleasure meant that she just started treating herself better. And then she quit her job. Like, I need to be living my best life right now. And I ain't doing it. And I'm like, wow, okay. That's it. So now remember, this is not causation, this is correlation, right? It's not like you're gonna start doing your own work and all of a sudden, X, Y, Z. But it is co-benefits. It is, if you do this work yourself, you will see the things that you are planting in terms of your financial goals, in terms of your business goals, in terms of your goals with your soil and your land and your communities. They will start to grow differently and grow better because we build things in our image. And that is something I encourage you to look at. Whatever issues are happening with your land right now or your animals or anything, where is that within you? Where are you in this, and where is that reflection? And how can you work on both of those things at the same time? So to recap, fertility is a framework that can provide inspiration for any and every area of life. What does it take to create the conditions conducive to life and then let life go and do its thing? What does it look like to simultaneously pay attention to those conditions while you are also paying attention to the things that you're growing with your business, with your family, with your communities? When it comes to that conversation about pruning disease, what do we damage by our lack of patience and attunement in our actions? How do you compost the things that need to be turned under the soil instead of throwing people away? When it comes to organizational and business culture, what are your goals? And how much do you value the inherent value of things and allow that inherent value to become love that then becomes connection, instead of being so strategic in your approach to your life, to the people in your life, that your life feels like a constant transaction? How do you invest in the tangible skills to integrate discomfort and invest in diversity so that there's just enough friction and healthy stress to create resiliency? And then how do you give your teams, your businesses, your land enough space, enough of their own connection so that those mycorrhizal networks form and they just start handling stuff without you even knowing? Problems crop up, you didn't even know because you just saw goodness on the other end. How can you let go, really? I know there's no control freaks like me in this room. You don't struggle with that at all. And then coaching as cover crop. How are you always asking yourself about your protection strategies against the intensity of the world and all the things coming at you? Which parts of you are brittle and eroding? How can you create protection strategies that aren't instinctual defenses, but choiceful strategies that allow you to give and receive with good boundaries? How are you then taking these strategies into your teams, your businesses, and the communities that you're building? And really, that's where I want to end. Leadership, really the definition of leadership that I've become the most attached to, it's the cultivation of so much joy and so much inner peace. And not the like woo-woo version of inner peace, but legit inner peace. That you can be with the world as it is. That's now my definition of leadership. Because the world as it is can feel pretty shitty. Leadership is about being able to be with violence non-violently. It's calculus level stuff. That level of acceptance, that level of inner peace is the fertile soil that then can allow for the impossible to form. Because if you've done community organizing, or you've run a business, or you've tried to be married, or you've tried to raise kids, you know that accepting another person exactly as they are is the first step to getting them to change, of all ironies. Right? You know what I'm talking about. That's how you change the world. That is how you do things that others eventually will call revolutionary. But it starts with you. And it starts with you being the beautiful people that you are, and taking the tools and the wisdom you learn from the soil and that you learn from fertility and bringing it into the rest of your lives and sharing it with me too. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And I think we have some time for Q&A. Is that? It's 11:26. What time is the session over? Anybody have the program? It's over at 11:45? Wonderful. We've got some time for questions or comments or anything. There's a microphone right there, if you would like.
Hello.
Hi.
I was wondering if you could talk about what you mean when you use the word shadow.
Yeah. Woo! We're about to get into a conversation
I hope so,
right now.
Yeah.
So when I'm saying shadow, I'm really talking about the things that are hidden. A lot of times the way shadow is used in psychology and things, it really is just talking about whatever is true about us that we can't see. It's good things and it's bad things, right? Or good and bad. And the way that shadow usually shows up and how we know it's there is we like something or we dislike something, right? So that person you just cannot stand that's doing all those things, that is your shadow projecting itself and saying, hello, I'm ready to be integrated now so you can see me. And how wonderful that this projection screen has been brought to you so that you have a first step at seeing it. And things that you like, same thing. Those are things about you that you just can't feel ready to step into yet. But being able to appreciate them out there is your first step to owning them in here. So the idea of shadow is just that we are everything, right? Which is the universal concept. We have everything inside of us. The possibility of everything is in us. We just don't consider everything us. And so doing shadow integration work and trying to mine the things that we like and dislike out there and see them within us allows us to be more whole over time. So when I talk about shadow integration, it's doing that process. It's going through a step-by-step process with people of identification of the projections and the things that really get you, both good and bad, and then a series of safe experiments to allow you to practice trying them on so that at the end of it, you see them as you. Was that?
Yeah. Radical,
okay.
Thank you.
And the only other thing I'll say, thank you. So the only other thing I'll say about shadow is that what I just described was the very personal process of shadow integration, but at every level of system it exists. It exists at the individual level, it exists at the group level, and it exists at the collective level. And some of the other work that we've done is looking at African Americans as the shadow of America. That when the settlers first came, they needed something to react against so that they could form an identity. They were a bunch of colonies from different places in Europe, and they needed to define themselves. And whiteness was an identity. And there is a way to look at that unemotionally, just from the lens of psychology, and see that first they tried it with Native Americans who were like, pshaw. Oh, this is our land, honey. I don't know what you thought. You ain't about to enslave us. So then they created a global economy to bring Africans from across the continents and create blackness and create African Americans so that they knew what they weren't, so they could know what they were. And in many ways, we continue to be the shadow of this country, even though we're only 12%. The cops that kill us, that shoot first and ask questions later, are reacting to their own shadows out there. So a lot of our work is being able to use this frame to help people differentiate when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion work. The high emotion, I can't do it side from, oh, there are frameworks and tools I can use to deal with this. And to just accept that we all have bias and prejudice and shadow. And that collectively, culturally, we've made some decisions about how that shows up for most of us, and that's not a good or a bad thing, it just is. Other questions? Comments?
Good morning.
Good morning.
You mentioned about brittleness and
Yes.
cover cropping yourself from brittleness, and I just wonder if you have some examples of people you've worked with and general ideas. I'm sure we can all cultivate ideas of those, but I'm curious about the people that you've worked with and what they've done.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of a good one for you here. Okay. So one of my clients was really struggling with her marriage. And she was also struggling, I'm not going to say her name or anything about her just in case she's watching right now, but she was also really struggling with hopelessness when it came to climate change, when it came to all of the devastating things that are happening right now. She was just losing hope, and it was impacting her family. So part of the strategy that she did, and I'm just going to give a super basic one so that there can be mass appeal, is self-care.
Yeah.
That first step of treating oneself nonviolently, and it wasn't just like, let's take a bath, let's get some candles. It wasn't that kind of self-care. The self-care that she chose to do was reconnecting with her family. That she acknowledged that she had let her relationship with her parents and her brother and her sister get deeply strained because they voted differently. But when I went through exercises with her to try to find where did she experience the most safety in her life, it was growing up in snow and sledding with her brothers and her sisters. And it was her mother's cooking. She deeply missed her family, but she could not reconcile the way that they were choosing to interact in life right now. So part of the cover cropping work that we did was give her the ability to do that shadow work and to see your parents' opinions, your brothers and sisters' opinions are not who they are. That's 20% of an infinite being. And you can choose to connect with the 80% of them and get things from the 80% of them and let the rest of it absorb. Find the places in you that can compost that and just let it go. And the impact of that, which is what I'll end with, it's not to say that the things her family was saying she didn't interact with at all. It's that she practiced not interacting and not reacting until she had so much, she was filled up so much by interacting with her family that eventually when they said something, she was able to say the perfect response that acknowledged it and created enough of a spark that something new was created. And her family did eventually start to turn, but the key was to not intervene too quickly. The key was to have her cover crop long enough before starting to plant a crop, which was the change in her family, that she had the perfect mix of things and wasn't being reactionary or just disrespectful, frankly, to her parents when responding to them. So that, I chose a personal example versus a big professional one because that felt the most applicable, but that's an example.
Great.
Did that help?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Completely. Thank you.
Yeah. Anything else? We've got probably time for one or two more. Even if there's no questions, I would love to hear just what hit you most, what you felt most personally connected to there, if you'd be willing to share.
Something that has helped me is to have a distinction between who the person is and their behavior. Mm-hmm. And it allows me to completely love somebody, mm-hmm. but find their behavior still abhorrent. Mm-hmm. And then a practice of realizing because there is a perfect loving person there, to have the respect to want to just listen as to why are they exhibiting that behavior, which usually goes to some form of deep fear, and waiting and listening until they're done talking. And people mostly just want to be heard if we'll just be quiet and wait and not start lobbing shells back and forth at our philosophical differences. So yeah. I just wanted to say that.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And another thing I'll say, yeah, please. Another thing I'll say really quickly in response to that is something that's come up a lot in my work is, but those opinions are actually causing real harm. Like kids are dying at the border. I cannot not respond to that. And what I say to that usually, and this may be controversial, so if it is, please come talk to me. But 9 times out of 10, when we get into situations like that, what that person is saying isn't in that moment, in real time, actively hurting anyone. They are words. I do work with people and have worked with people throughout my career who are like, I have a gun in my face right now. How do I use these strategies there? That is not this talk. That is a different talk. Those are a different set of tools. And the conflation of opinions and words with real life harm is deeply damaging us right now. We are translating one and making it the other, taking things to their logical conclusion in some imagined world. And that's just, it's not true. So what I would encourage you to do there is if active harm isn't happening right then, if you aren't trying to physically stop someone from physically hurting another person, use these tools of conversation or use acceptance. And trust that you accepting what they're saying, as vitriolic as it may sound, and sitting there and being with it within yourself, they could be sitting and talking to someone who actually agreed with them. And that would be more harmful than you holding a different opinion and loving them anyway. Just that act is doing something differently than what would be happening if you weren't doing it. That is less harm. And that's really the path of nonviolence. I just wanted to emphasize that. That's nonviolence. It's not trying so hard sometimes. Go ahead.
So you talked about creating space, which I think is definitely like a conversation that a lot of people are starting to have, especially in those ways. And if you could speak to that a little bit in terms of action, and then also holding space. Because I know even in this room, I was distracted by a lot of people that weren't holding that space. So how to actively hold that space for people that definitely deserve their respect like you.
So your question is, when I was talking about the Michael Reisel networks, how to build and create space and things? Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So usually what I tell people is to start very personally before, in terms of those levels of system, individual, group, and collective, they are linear when it comes to new skills. Things that you can master yourself, you can start to practice in small groups, which then you can start to practice in the collective. And when I say practice in small groups, I mean with people that love you as a human being, so that when you make mistakes, they can be like, yeah, that was bad. And let's go get some pizza. And it's not going to be that big a deal. So practically speaking, when it comes to you yourself, usually what I encourage people to do is start with social media, because it's a high bar practice area that is very little risk for you. And one of the safe experiments that I've encouraged people to take on, and that I do myself, there are people in my life that I grew up with, that I'm not blood related to, but that I share life experience with. They know parts of me that no one else can actually ever know, because we just experienced those things when we were 12. And there's a level of real, you just can't fake that. And I attempt on social media to find those people that have different opinions than me, and to actively ask them about their lives, and just ignore everything else. How is your husband doing? How are your kids? I saw the other day that they were sick. Is she okay? And to practice the cultivation of real care there. And actually just not address the other things until they organically come up. And even if they do organically come up, I can say something like, nothing. Because it's on social media. I can choose to respond to what I can choose to respond to, and just skip whole messages if I want to. So at an individual level, that's usually where I tell people to start if they want to take on a very basic practice. And then there's a whole bunch of other stuff at the group and collective parts. But then I would say when it comes to being in environments where you observe people not creating space, one of the reasons I say it's linear and starting with self, then group, then collective, is because the deeper one tends to go in this work, the deeper one tends to realize that it's very hard to ever assume you know what's going on in another person or in another group of people, and that everyone is always doing their best. And so a part of that first level of work is cultivating so much love and respect for yourself that you can love and respect someone's best, even when it looks to you fairly shitty, especially if it's not impacting you in any way. They're just over there doing their thing. Go with God. So that would be it. And I think with that, I'm done. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.